The story does not begin with myth, faith, or poetry. It begins with records, dry administrative lines pressed into clay by people who believed they were documenting reality, not inventing legends. These texts speak of decisions, borders, labor, punishment, and withdrawal. They describe a world where civilization did not rise naturally but was installed, managed, corrected, and ultimately abandoned. Cities were not founded by human ambition alone, but assigned. Kings did not rule by inspiration but by authorization, and when the system began to fail, the response was not mercy, but restructuring on a planetary scale. Floods were tools, silence was policy, destruction was sanctioned. What follows is not a tale of gods fighting monsters, but of an administration collapsing under its own contradictions. The evidence does not shout, it accumulates, and once the pattern becomes visible, it cannot be unseen. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. Imagine holding a clay tablet no larger than your palm, its surface cracked, edges broken, the writing interrupted mid-line. It was buried for nearly 4,000 years, not hidden deliberately, simply abandoned when the building that housed it collapsed and was never repaired. The text on it is not lyrical. There is no praise, no invocation, no metaphor. It reads like a report, and buried among measurements, names, and actions is a sentence so stark it feels out of place. When the Anunnaki raised war against the Anunnaki, not against humans, not against chaos, against themselves. Museums at night feel empty, almost sterile. The halls are quiet, lights dimmed, footsteps echoing against stone. But behind locked doors, in storage rooms never shown on guided tours, sit tens of thousands of similar tablets. They are catalogued, photographed, numbered, and mostly unread. Not because scholars cannot read them, but because many do not fit neatly into familiar categories. They are not myths in the usual sense. They do not behave like religious texts meant to inspire or instruct. They behave like fragments of an internal archive, never meant for public consumption. At the beginning of the 21st century, while reviewing fragments brought from Nineveh in the 19th century, a researcher noticed something strange. Several damaged tablets, long dismissed as secondary copies or irrelevant administrative debris, shared overlapping phrases. On their own, each fragment said little. Together they formed a sequence, mentions of councils, allocations of land, references to division, then complaints, laments, and finally descriptions of cities where birds no longer sang and fields remained poisoned through multiple harvests. These were not stories set in a vague mythic dawn. They were anchored to a specific past, treated by the scribes themselves as already ancient history. To understand why this matters, it is necessary to understand who wrote these texts and the world they believed they lived in. Sumer emerged in southern Mesopotamia, a region that should not have produced the first complex civilization. There was no stone for monuments, no forests for timber. The soil was salty, floods unpredictable, the climate unforgiving. Yet around 4000 BCE, something changed abruptly. Small villages transformed into cities, defensive walls appeared, vast irrigation systems were constructed, administrative centers formed, and alongside them emerged writing, not as crude symbols, but as a fully developed system capable of recording contracts, laws, technical procedures, and history. Archaeology shows this transition was rapid. It does not resemble slow cultural evolution. Even the Sumerians themselves did not claim credit for inventing their civilization. They insisted they were taught. Again and again their texts name the teachers the Anunnaki. These were not abstract forces or poetic personifications. They were described as rulers, landowners, administrators. Each major city belonged to one. The god of the city lived there, maintained a household, owned fields, received food, clothing, and labor. Humans did not worship in the modern sense. They worked. Canals were dug for the gods. Temples functioned as economic hubs, managing grain, livestock, and labor. Lists of the earliest cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, are confirmed archaeologically. These were real places operating long before the pyramids of Egypt. Among the most unsettling documents is the Sumerian king list, which opens with a line that reads like a technical note rather than a legend, when kingship descended from heaven. It then lists rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years before the flood and for hundreds afterward. The text offers no explanation for the change. It simply records it the way an accountant records altered figures after an audit. The flood itself, as described in Sumerian and later Akkadian texts, is not framed as moral punishment. There is no concept of sin as later religions would define it. The problem is described with a single word that means noise, clamor, constant disturbance. Humanity had multiplied too quickly. Their activity interfered with the system. The solution proposed by the council was total destruction. Not symbolic cleansing, elimination. One god, Enki objected, not openly. He did not overturn the decision. He circumvented it, warning a single human indirectly, preserving the species while technically obeying the letter of the law. This act created something unprecedented, a split within the ruling council. That split never healed. And it raises an uncomfortable question. If the council could fracture over the fate of humanity, over what else might it fracture later? The texts do not answer directly. They do not describe a dramatic declaration of war. Instead, they whisper through laments and aftermaths. They speak of temples abandoned, of protective winds withdrawn and replaced by hostile ones that covered the land like cloth. They describe gods who no longer reside in their cities, who turn their faces away. One thing becomes clear when these sources are read slowly, without forcing them into familiar mythological frameworks. Civilization did not collapse because humans became too violent or corrupt. It collapsed because the administrators who maintained it lost the ability to coordinate. The system failed from the top down. Before humans were created, the texts say, the gods themselves performed the labor. They dug canals, reinforced riverbanks, drained marshes. After 40 years of this work, the lower-ranked gods, called the Igigi, rebelled. They burned their tools at night and surrounded the residents of Enlil, the chief administrator of earthly affairs. This was not a symbolic protest. The language used describes a siege. The message was simple. The work was unbearable. The response was not immediate violence. It was a meeting, an emergency council involving Anu, the nominal sovereign, Enlil, the executive authority, Enki, the master of subterranean waters and technical wisdom, and Ninhursag, the specialist in birth and biological processes. The solution they approved was not compassion, it was efficiency. A new species would be created, mortal, controllable, capable of labor. Humanity was not designed as a partner, but as infrastructure. The creation process is described with unsettling precision. A god associated with the rebellion was sacrificed. His flesh and blood were mixed with clay. From this material, 14 human prototypes were formed, 7 male, 7 female. The language used is the same language used for molding bricks or preparing compound materials. Humanity was a hybrid solution, biological labor designed to stabilize a failing system. It worked, briefly. The Agigi were freed, the cities flourished, but the variable introduced to solve one problem created another. Humans multiplied. Their activity grew. The noise returned. The same system that had avoided direct confrontation once now faced instability again, with even higher stakes. From this point forward, the texts shift tone. They become less explanatory, more reactive. Decisions are recorded, but motivations grow opaque. Authority becomes contested. Symbols of power, like the Tablets of Destiny, essentially legal instruments that made commands binding, are stolen, lost, recovered. Each theft triggers administrative paralysis. Orders stop functioning. Fate itself, understood as enforceable decision, becomes unstable. What emerges is not a myth of divine perfection, but a record of governance under strain. A hierarchy designed for control becomes vulnerable to sabotage. Autonomy spreads, jurisdictions fracture. Some domains, like the underworld, operate independently, enforcing their own laws even against major gods. Others retreat entirely. By the time cities begin to fall in synchronized waves around 2000 BCE, the collapse no longer looks accidental. Gods leave before destruction arrives. Protection is withdrawn first. Enemies enter later. Fields become barren not just from war, but from neglect and long-term damage. The laments insist on one point repeatedly: this outcome was decided. Taken together, these sources suggest a reality far more unsettling than simple myth. They describe a managed world, an imposed order, and a prolonged internal conflict that escalated not through heroic battles, but through policy, sabotage, and increasingly irreversible decisions. What we call the final war was not announced. It unfolded quietly at first, then catastrophically, until the system that created civilization judged its own continuation too dangerous to sustain. After the flood, nothing returned to the way it had been. The waters receded, sacrifices were offered, agreements were spoken aloud, but the structure that had governed the world before was already compromised. The rupture created when one god circumvented a unanimous decision did not close, it hardened. From that moment forward, authority among the Anunnaki existed, but obedience could no longer be assumed. Every later crisis unfolded in the shadow of that precedent. The Sumerian king list records this shift without commentary. Before the flood, kingship is described as descending from heaven once, remaining continuous, uninterrupted. After the flood, kingship descends again, as if the previous installation had been invalidated. Rule becomes fragmented, reigns shorten dramatically. Tens of thousands of years give way to centuries, then to decades. The text does not explain why. It simply notes the change, the way an engineer might note a drop in output after a system failure. Direct rule by gods over cities gradually disappears. Temples still stand, offerings still arrive, but the gods themselves are no longer described as residing permanently within them. Instead, human kings rule on behalf of the gods. This phrasing matters. It marks a transfer of operational authority. The gods retain nominal ownership, but day-to-day control shifts downward. The system becomes indirect, buffered, less exposed. This is not progress, it is risk mitigation. At the center of this unstable arrangement lies an object that appears again and again in moments of crisis: the Tablet of Destinies. In modern terms, it is best understood not as a magical artifact, but as a legal instrument. In Mesopotamian culture, a written document sealed with authority was binding. It did not symbolize power, it executed it. Whoever possessed the tablet could issue commands that reality itself was obligated to follow. Crops grew or failed, victories occurred. Authority was enforced because the record said so. Originally, this tablet belonged to Enlil, the chief administrator of the terrestrial order. His role was not that of a warrior king, but of a regulator, a manager of systems. The tablet formalized his authority, but after the flood something unprecedented happens. The tablet becomes transferable, it can be stolen. The earliest detailed account of this theft appears in the Epic of Anzu. Anzu is not a demon in the later sense. He is a subordinate, a guardian of Enlil's chamber, close enough to observe the rituals that activated authority. He waits for a moment of vulnerability and takes the tablet. The effect is immediate. Commands cease to function. Decisions no longer bind. The text describes this not poetically, but administratively. Order halts. Destiny itself becomes undefined. The council assembles in panic, but no one rushes to confront Anzu. Several gods explicitly refuse. They understand the risk. Anzu, holding the tablet, can negate any direct attack. Authority itself has been weaponized. Eventually, Ninurta, Enlil's son, accepts the task. Even then, he does not succeed through force alone. Enki intervenes again, providing a workaround. Anzu's mobility is removed. The tablet is dropped. Authority is restored. The crucial detail is not the recovery, it is the theft. A subordinate successfully removed the core mechanism of governance. The system had no internal safeguard against this. And it happens again. In the Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish, the Tablet of Destinies reappears. This time it is handed to Kingu, a figure elevated not by merit, but by possession of the tablet. Power is no longer inherent. It is procedural. When Marduk defeats Kingu, the tablet transfers again. Each transfer represents a regime change, a restructuring of authority achieved not through consensus, but through disruption. This is the backdrop against which cities begin to fail. The gods are no longer a unified executive body. They operate in factions, defend their own jurisdictions, and prioritize containment over coordination. Some domains become autonomous. The underworld, governed by Ereshkigal, enforces its laws independently. When Inanna enters without authorization, she is stripped of power systematically at 7 gates, each removal corresponding to a legal deprivation of authority. By the time she reaches the throne room, she is no longer a god in any operational sense. She is judged and executed. No immediate retaliation follows. The council does not intervene. 2 major gods refuse to help. Only Enki acts, again, indirectly, exploiting procedural loopholes. The message is clear. The old guarantees no longer apply. Gods can be detained, killed, or neutralized within defined jurisdictions. Sovereignty has fragmented. As this fragmentation deepens, cities become liabilities. A city is not just a population center. It is an administrative node, a logistical hub, a claim. Defending it requires coordination. When coordination fails, withdrawal becomes rational. The texts begin to describe gods leaving cities. This does not mean abandonment in an emotional sense. It means termination of protection contracts. A city without its god is no longer defended, supplied, or regulated. The laments that follow are precise in their language. They do not describe heroic last stands. They describe silence, gates unguarded, temples empty, then destruction. Armies arrive later. The decisive moment is the withdrawal, not the invasion. What follows is not conquest, but collapse. One recurring element stands out in these descriptions: the arrival of a hostile wind. This evil wind is not synonymous with an army. It is described as covering the land, entering houses, killing indiscriminately, affecting crops, animals, and water. Its effects persist beyond the destruction of buildings. Fields remain barren. Canals fail. Life does not return. This matters because it suggests the use of methods whose consequences extended beyond immediate military objectives. The texts distinguish clearly between warfare and this phenomenon. The wind is invoked, permitted, or released. It behaves like a deployed force, not a natural disaster. By the time the third dynasty of collapses, the pattern is unmistakable. Major urban centers fail within the same period. Administrative records end abruptly. Supply chains break. Entire regions depopulate. Reconstruction does not occur. Gods do not return. The system does not reboot. What emerges from these fragments is not the story of a single cataclysm, but of a prolonged failure cascade. Authority becomes contestable. Legal instruments become weapons. Jurisdictions turn inward. Extreme measures are authorized. Cities are written off. Land is rendered unusable. And finally, the administrators themselves withdraw, not in defeat, but in recognition that the system can no longer be stabilized without unacceptable risk. This is the context in which the final phase must be understood, not as a sudden war declared with banners and armies, but as a slow escalation of internal conflict, where each solution narrowed the available options until withdrawal became the only viable outcome. The silence that follows in the texts is not accidental. It is the sound of a system shutting down. By the time the cities began to disappear, the Anunnaki were no longer acting as a single authority, but as isolated centers of decision-making, each bound to its own territory, interests, and risks. What followed was not chaos in the sense of randomness, but fragmentation. Order still existed, but it was local, conditional, and fragile. The laments record this shift with unsettling clarity. They do not describe gods losing battles. They describe gods choosing absence. In Sumerian thought, a god was not an abstract presence. A god lived somewhere. That place was a temple, and the temple was not merely a shrine. It was a residence, an administrative headquarters, a storage facility, and a symbol of jurisdiction. When a text says a god left a city, it means that the god terminated residence, removed authority, and withdrew protection. This was not metaphorical language. It was a legal and logistical statement. Once a god departed, the fate of the city was effectively sealed. Walls could still stand, armies could still be raised, but without divine authorization, the city was no longer integrated into the wider system. The laments emphasize this moment repeatedly because it marks the true beginning of destruction. The invasion comes later, the decision comes first. One of the earliest and most detailed examples appears in the laments concerning Ur. At its height, Ur was not a marginal settlement. It was the center of a highly organized state with taxation, standardized labor, long-distance trade, and a complex irrigation network. Administrative tablets record grain deliveries down to the last measure, lists of workers by name, legal disputes, and diplomatic correspondence. This was not a fragile society. It collapsed rapidly. The texts do not blame this collapse on military incompetence or moral failure. They return again and again to the same formulation. The god of the city departed, the decision was confirmed, and the city was handed over. Enlil is named not as an attacker, but as an authorizer. Anu is named as one who approved. This is not the language of accident. It is the language of policy. What followed is described in terms that differ sharply from ordinary warfare. People are found dead inside their homes, not on battlements. Streets are filled with bodies, but not with evidence of prolonged fighting. Fire is mentioned, but not as a spreading blaze consuming structures. It is described as something that overwhelms, suppresses, and immobilizes. Buildings do not collapse into rubble, they become dust. Dust is a recurring image in these texts, and it is a strange one. In typical destruction layers, archaeology finds walls, bricks, ash, debris. The laments describe something else. Structures are said to vanish into powder. The land itself is altered. Fields stop producing. Canals silt up and are not cleared. Fish disappear from the rivers. Grazing lands empty. These are not short-term effects of looting or siege. They indicate long-term environmental damage. This damage is attributed repeatedly to what the texts call the evil wind. The term is consistent across multiple laments and contexts. It is never used interchangeably with armies or storms. It is introduced as a separate factor with its own behavior and consequences. The wind covers the land rather than moving through it. It enters enclosed spaces. It kills people and animals alike. And after it passes, the land remains hostile to life. The duration of this hostility matters. The texts specify multiple agricultural cycles without recovery. In a region where irrigation and human labor could usually restore productivity within a season or two, this persistence is abnormal. It suggests contamination, not destruction alone. The laments emphasize that no one returns to repair the canals or replant the fields. This is not because people choose not to. It is because the conditions make return impossible. At this stage, the behavior of the gods changes noticeably. They are no longer described as issuing detailed instructions or engaging in debates. Decisions are announced, not argued. Explanations disappear. The narrative voice shifts from reporting actions to mourning outcomes. This stylistic change is not accidental. It reflects a transition from governance to aftermath. The destruction of Akkad occupies a special place within this pattern. Unlike Uruk, or Nippur, Akkad is never rebuilt. Its location is lost. For the capital of a once dominant empire, this is extraordinary. The primary text addressing its fate, often called the Curse of Akkad, is not a lament but an indictment. It accuses the ruler, Naram Sin, of violating divine jurisdiction by attacking the sacred precinct of Enlil. The response described is precise. Protection is withdrawn. Hostile forces are permitted entry. Infrastructure fails. Canals dry up. Trade collapses. Famine follows. The city becomes uninhabitable. The text states explicitly that Akkad will not be restored. This is not a temporary punishment, it is a termination. What makes this significant is the scale and finality. Akkad was not destroyed in isolation. Its fall coincides with regional instability and the same environmental effects described elsewhere. The repeated pattern suggests a shared mechanism, not independent disasters. The gods are not reacting impulsively. They are applying a strategy. That strategy appears to prioritize containment over preservation. When a node becomes too risky, it is removed. When a territory becomes unstable, it is abandoned. This logic aligns with the earlier shift toward indirect rule. Direct presence carries risk. Withdrawal limits exposure. At the same time, the texts reveal discomfort with the consequences. In several laments, the gods themselves are said to weep. This is not sentimental imagery. In Sumerian literature, divine weeping indicates regret without reversal. The decision stands, but its cost is acknowledged. The system is operating, but without confidence. As more cities fall, the geographical footprint of divine administration shrinks. The gods retreat to mountains, distant regions, or inaccessible domains. Mountains in Sumerian thought are not simply high ground. They represent separation, remoteness, and boundary zones. To say a god went to the mountains is to say that God exited the operational space. Human rulers adapt. Kings stop claiming divine status. They present themselves as servants, stewards, intermediaries. Temples lose their role as economic command centers. Religious practice continues, but governance becomes fully human. The experiment of direct divine administration has ended. What the laments preserve is not nostalgia, but warning. They insist that the destruction was not random, not purely human, and not reversible. The gods did not lose control. They relinquished it, and in doing so they left behind a world permanently altered by decisions made during a conflict that could no longer be contained. By the end of this phase, the final war has not yet reached its most destructive expression, but its logic is firmly established. Authority fractures, extreme measures become acceptable, withdrawal replaces oversight, and the land itself begins to bear the scars of choices made by those who no longer intend to remain. As the centers of power collapsed one by one, the language of the texts shifted again, becoming more guarded, more indirect, as if the scribes themselves were approaching a boundary they were not meant to cross. Earlier records had described councils, arguments, and procedures in explicit terms. Now the tablets speak in fragments, formulas, and omissions. Events are acknowledged, but mechanisms are withheld. What remains is a pattern of consequences too consistent to ignore. One of the most telling signs of this transition is the sudden disappearance of complete narratives. Long, detailed accounts give way to broken sequences, sentences end abruptly, tablets stop mid-thought. In some cases, entire archives appear to have been destroyed at once. Archaeology confirms this. Storage rooms collapse under intense heat. Clay tablets are fired unintentionally, preserving fragments while erasing context. The result is a historical record that survives, but only in pieces. This matters because Mesopotamian culture prized preservation. Texts were copied, recopied, and standardized across centuries. When stories disappear instead of being rewritten, it suggests either loss so complete that recovery was impossible, or intentional suppression. The formulas that replace narrative detail are revealing. Phrases like, "that which must not be spoken," or "the secret of the great gods," appear with increasing frequency. This is not common language in earlier Sumerian literature, which tended to be blunt and procedural. The implication is not mystery for its own sake, but restriction. Certain knowledge is no longer considered suitable for transmission. The reasons are not stated, but the context offers clues. By this point, the consequences of earlier decisions are undeniable. Land has been rendered unusable. Cities have vanished permanently. The gods have withdrawn. To explain the precise causes would be to acknowledge failure at the highest level of authority. Within this silence, however, specific elements continue to surface. Fire appears repeatedly, but not in the form of ordinary conflagration. It does not consume structures in a way that leaves recognizable ruins. It suppresses movement, kills without discrimination, and leaves behind emptiness rather than debris. The texts emphasize its suddenness and its totality. People do not flee. They are overtaken. Alongside fire, the hostile wind remains a constant presence. It is invoked with formal language, described as something released or permitted. Its effects overlap with those of fire but extend further in time. The wind makes water undrinkable, soil infertile, and air itself dangerous. It is not described as a natural storm. Its arrival is deliberate, its retreat unmentioned. Once it has passed, the land remains altered. At this stage, the gods themselves are portrayed as cautious, even fearful, of the tools being used. This is a critical shift. In earlier texts, divine power is limitless and unquestioned. Now there are references to weapons or forces that must be purified after use, removed from circulation, or handled only by specific authorities. In one account, a god temporarily relinquishes control of a city in order to cleanse his instruments. During his absence, disorder spreads rapidly. This behavior indicates recognition of risk. The tools available are no longer precision instruments. Their effects cannot be fully contained. They solve immediate problems at the cost of long-term stability. Once such tools are deployed, restoration becomes secondary to survival. Another striking feature of this period is the collapse of documentation itself. Administrative tablets, which once recorded daily activity in extraordinary detail, simply stop. There are no records of rebuilding, no lists of returning workers, no new contracts. This absence is not due to lack of scribes. It is due to lack of administration. The system that generated records no longer functions. The disappearance of writing in certain regions coincides with ecological decline. Irrigation canals clog, salinization increases, fields are abandoned. These processes normally occur gradually and are reversible with labor. Here they accelerate and persist. The absence of recovery aligns with the textual insistence that the gods have turned away permanently. Human societies respond by adapting rather than restoring. Political structures shrink, power decentralizes, local rulers govern smaller territories, large-scale coordination disappears. This is not simply the result of invasion, it is the aftermath of a vacuum. Theological language adapts as well. The Anunnaki, once active administrators, recede into the background. They are referred to as ancient, former, or distant. Their functions are redistributed among newer deities who operate under different assumptions. These newer gods do not walk among cities. They issue signs, omens, and decrees from afar. The model of governance has changed. What is most revealing is what does not happen. There is no attempt to return to the previous system. No text speaks of rebuilding the old order. No god announces a plan to restore direct rule. This absence is decisive. It indicates that the prior arrangement is considered not merely damaged but unacceptable. The reason becomes clearer when the scattered clues are assembled. The conflict among the Anunnaki did not remain confined to debate or symbolic struggle. It escalated into actions that compromised the very environment on which their administration depended. Once the land itself became unstable, continued presence became a liability. The system was no longer governable. This explains the final withdrawal. It was not defeat, it was disengagement. The gods did not lose their power, they abandoned its application in a form that had proven too destructive. The cost of maintaining control exceeded the benefit. The scribes left behind recorded what they could. They preserved the outcomes, the losses, the laments. They avoided detailing the methods, not because they lacked knowledge, but because that knowledge undermined the legitimacy of all authority, divine or human. To say too much would be to admit that the world had been broken by those entrusted to manage it. What survives, therefore, is a shadow record. Enough to show that something unprecedented occurred, enough to demonstrate that it was sanctioned, deliberate, and catastrophic, but not enough to reconstruct every step. The silence is itself evidence. By the end of this phase, the final war has passed beyond open confrontation. It has become an absence, a retreat, a long-term abandonment. The cities lie empty, the land resists cultivation, the gods no longer intervene, and the texts, once so precise, fall quiet where explanation would be most dangerous. The world that follows is not restored, it is reduced, reshaped, and permanently marked by the consequences of a conflict that was never named, never fully described, but never forgotten. Long after the cities fell silent, memory did not disappear. It changed form. What could no longer be recorded directly began to survive through repetition, distortion, and ritual. The later texts do not erase the past, they reframe it. Conflict becomes anger, administrative failure becomes divine wrath. Systemic collapse is compressed into moral lessons. But beneath these reinterpretations, the original contours remain visible, like a buried structure whose outline still shapes the ground above it. One of the clearest signs of this transformation is the restructuring of the pantheon itself. In earlier periods, the Anunnaki occupy central operational roles. They manage land, labor, law, and resources. After the collapse, they recede. They do not vanish, but they are reassigned. In later Babylonian and Assyrian texts, the Anunnaki appear primarily as judges of the underworld or as ancestral figures associated with a distant, concluded age. Their authority is symbolic, not executive. This shift coincides with the rise of new central deities, most notably Marduk. His elevation is explained through narrative justification, most famously in the Enuma Elish, where he is rewarded with supreme authority after defeating a cosmic threat. On the surface, this appears to be a creation story. In context, it functions as a political document. It does not describe how the old order collapsed. It describes why a new one is now legitimate. The language is careful. Power is said to be transferred willingly. Authority is granted unanimously. Conflict is resolved cleanly. What is missing is any reference to the prolonged instability, the thefts of authority, the abandoned cities, or the environmental devastation. The story does not deny that change occurred. It denies that the change was catastrophic. This kind of narrative revision is typical after systemic trauma. The goal is not to lie, but to stabilize. A society cannot function while openly acknowledging that its highest authorities destroyed the world they governed. So the memory is softened. The conflict is externalized. The gods do not fight each other. They fight chaos, monsters, or abstract threats. Yet even in these revised versions, fragments of the original experience persist. Floods remain, fire from the sky remains, winds that kill remain, cities destroyed by divine decision remain. What disappears is the admission of internal conflict. Unity is imposed retroactively. Beyond Mesopotamia, the same patterns appear. In Anatolian texts, gods withdraw after catastrophic events. In Levantine traditions, cities are destroyed by fire, not caused by human armies. In early Hebrew texts, floods, divine abandonment, and scorched lands recur. The explanation changes, but the imagery remains consistent. These similarities are not evidence of copying in a simple sense. They reflect shared inheritance of trauma. When an event alters the world so profoundly that it cannot be fully explained, cultures encode it in durable forms. Myth becomes storage, ritual becomes repetition, language becomes compression. One recurring motif is the division of time itself. Texts begin to speak of a before and an after. The age when gods walked among humans is contrasted with the present age, where contact is rare and indirect. This distinction appears across cultures and persists for millennia. It signals a perceived rupture, not gradual change. Another motif is restriction. Knowledge once available is now forbidden. Sacred spaces become inaccessible. Names cannot be spoken. These prohibitions do not protect holiness. They protect stability. They ensure that certain questions are not asked too directly. The environmental dimension of the collapse also persists in memory. Lands rendered barren are remembered as cursed. Cities never rebuilt become warnings. The absence of recovery becomes part of the story. These are not metaphors invented later. They correspond to real regions that remained depopulated or underutilized long after the initial destruction. Archaeology confirms this persistence. Layers of abandonment coincide with textual references to divine withdrawal. Irrigation systems fall out of use and are not repaired. Settlement patterns shift permanently. The world after the collapse is smaller, more fragmented, and more cautious. What emerges is a new model of divine-human interaction. Gods no longer administer directly. They set boundaries, issue signs, and enforce limits. Humans govern themselves within those limits. Responsibility shifts downward. Failure becomes human failure, not divine malfunction. This is not theology alone. It is governance adapted to constraint. The memory of the final war, therefore, survives not as a single story, but as a constellation of themes: divine withdrawal, catastrophic destruction, environmental ruin, the end of an age. Each culture emphasizes different aspects, but the core remains recognizable. Importantly, none of these later traditions suggest that the old order might return. The age of direct divine rule is consistently portrayed as closed. It belongs to a dangerous past. Even when idealized, it is not proposed as a future model. The warning is implicit. What was once attempted ended badly. This collective reluctance to revisit the old arrangement speaks volumes. It implies recognition that the system failed not because of minor error, but because of structural flaws, concentrated authority without accountability, tools with irreversible consequences, decisions made without the possibility of reversal. The Anunnaki, in this light, are not defeated tyrants or benevolent creators. They are administrators whose project exceeded its tolerances. The final war was not fought to win. It was fought until continuation became impossible. Memory preserves this outcome in fragments because fragments are safer than clarity. They allow societies to remember without reliving. They warn without destabilizing. They encode history as myth so that the lesson endures even when the details fade. What remains thousands of years later is not a complete account, but enough to reconstruct the shape of events, a world governed directly by powerful beings, an internal conflict that escalated, methods that damaged the land itself, a decision to withdraw rather than rebuild, and a long aftermath in which humanity learned to govern alone in a world permanently altered by a war that no one ever named aloud. As the memory of direct divine rule receded into myth, the physical world continued to bear its marks. The landscape itself became the most persistent witness to what had occurred. Long after the laments ceased and new pantheons took shape, the land in southern Mesopotamia remained unevenly scarred, productive in some regions, barren in others, as if the damage had not been uniform. This unevenness is difficult to explain through climate change or ordinary warfare alone. It aligns far more closely with selective abandonment. The Sumerians had mastered irrigation in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. Their canals, levees, and reservoirs required constant maintenance, but when maintained, they could sustain dense populations. Normally, when cities fell to human enemies, these systems were quickly repaired by conquerors who needed them just as badly. After the final collapse, this did not happen. Entire canal networks were left to silt up. Fields were not reclaimed. Settlement shifted northward, away from some of the oldest heartlands of civilization. Texts written generations later acknowledge this reality indirectly. They speak of lands that refused the plough and waters that no longer listened to human command. This language may sound poetic, but it reflects a technical problem. Once irrigation water becomes too saline, once soil chemistry is altered beyond a certain threshold, recovery can take centuries, even with labor. The laments insist that recovery never came. This environmental persistence explains another striking feature of the historical record, the absence of large-scale return. Mesopotamian societies were resilient. They rebuilt repeatedly after invasions, floods, and famines. What happened here broke that pattern. Some cities were never resettled, others returned only as minor towns, never regaining their former scale or complexity. In parallel, the role of writing itself changes. Early Sumerian and Akkadian texts are obsessed with precision. They list, measure, and record relentlessly. After the collapse, texts become more generalized. They describe conditions, omens, and moral frameworks rather than operations. This is not a decline in literacy, it is a shift in purpose. Writing no longer supports direct management of a divine economy. It supports interpretation of a world humans must now manage alone. The priesthood adapts accordingly. Priests are no longer overseers of divine estates. They become interpreters of signs. Divination replaces administration. Instead of issuing instructions, gods are asked questions. Instead of commands, there are responses. This shift is profound. It reflects an acceptance that the gods are no longer present as managers. Kings adjust their titles as well. Claims of divinity disappear. Kings present themselves as chosen, favored, or guided, but not as gods incarnate. This restraint is not humility, it is caution. The memory of what happened when rulers crossed certain boundaries remains strong. Even so, traces of the old fear linger. Later texts frequently warn against provoking divine anger through excess, arrogance, or overreach. These warnings are not abstract. They are grounded in remembered consequences. The idea that cities can be erased permanently, that land can be rendered unusable, becomes a core anxiety. The pattern repeats in stories of other destroyed cities. Sodom and Gomorrah in biblical tradition, Hattusa in Anatolian memory. Each account emphasizes sudden destruction, fire from above, abandonment, and a warning quality. The details differ, the structure remains. These stories do not claim that humans defeated the gods, nor do they suggest that gods were defeated by monsters. Instead, they frame destruction as a result of divine decision. What is omitted is why such decisions became necessary. That omission is consistent across cultures. What can be reconstructed from the earlier Mesopotamian record is that the final phase of conflict involved methods whose side effects could not be undone. Once deployed, they forced a strategic retreat. Continued occupation of affected regions was too dangerous, even for the gods. This explains why later traditions depict the gods as distant, transcendent, and largely uninvolved in daily affairs. This is not a theological evolution toward abstraction. It is a pragmatic adaptation to absence. When direct presence becomes impossible, distance becomes sacred. It also explains why later religions emphasize obedience, restraint, and moral order. These values are not simply ethical ideals, they are safeguards. They aim to prevent a return to the conditions that once justified catastrophic intervention. The final war, therefore, does not end with victory or defeat. It ends with withdrawal and redefinition. The gods redefine their role. Humanity redefines its responsibility. The world itself enforces the outcome by refusing to be reset. In this context, the persistence of memory is remarkable. Even after thousands of years, the core elements remain recognizable. A time when gods ruled directly. A breakdown within that system. A sequence of catastrophic decisions, a permanent change in how the world functions. What is absent from all later retellings is any suggestion that the old system should be restored. This absence is as meaningful as any surviving text. It signals consensus across generations that the previous model was untenable. The Anunnaki become ancient not because they are forgotten, but because their way of governing is obsolete. They belong to a closed chapter, one whose reopening would risk repeating irreversible damage. The world learned, through catastrophe, that some forms of power cannot be exercised without destroying the conditions that make power meaningful. By the time history resumes in a form recognizable to us, the final war has already done its work. It has erased cities, altered landscapes, restructured belief, and redefined authority. What follows is not recovery, but adaptation to limits imposed by events, too destructive to name directly. And so the silence that surrounds the final phase is not ignorance, it is restraint. The story is remembered just well enough to ensure it is never repeated. With distance came reinterpretation, but also anxiety. The generations that followed the collapse inherited a world that no longer behaved as expected. Rivers still flowed, but unpredictably. Fields that had once yielded abundance resisted cultivation. Some regions prospered while others remained empty, avoided, or remembered only through warning formulas. These uneven outcomes fed a new kind of thinking, one less confident in control and more attuned to limits. Omens rise to prominence in this period for a reason. When administration fails, prediction becomes survival. Later, Mesopotamian texts overflow with lists of signs, eclipses, malformed births, unusual winds, sudden animal deaths. Each sign is catalogued not for curiosity but for risk assessment. The world is no longer assumed to be stable, it must be read constantly for danger. This obsession reflects an inherited fear that catastrophe can return without warning. The earlier system relied on oversight and intervention. The new world relies on vigilance. Gods are no longer managers who fix problems. They are distant forces whose intentions must be inferred. This shift is subtle but total. The same change appears in architecture. Monumental construction slows. Ziggurats still rise, but they are fewer, smaller, and more symbolic. They no longer function as literal residences. They become markers of connection rather than centers of operation. The gods are honored, but not housed. Legal texts reveal a similar adjustment. Laws become more detailed, more restrictive, and more concerned with preventing escalation. Punishments are codified. Boundaries are emphasized. Excess is discouraged. These are not signs of growing cruelty. They are attempts to contain disorder before it spreads. One of the most telling changes occurs in how time is understood. Early texts assume continuity. Later ones emphasize cycles of rise and fall. Prosperity is temporary. Disaster is expected. This worldview does not celebrate collapse, but it prepares for it. Within this framework, the memory of the Anunnaki becomes cautionary. They are referenced as powerful but dangerous. Their age is described as extraordinary but unstable. The implication is clear. Proximity to overwhelming power invites catastrophe. This perspective reshapes theology. Gods are elevated beyond reach. Their remoteness becomes a virtue. Distance is safety. Direct contact, once celebrated, is now suspect. The divine-human boundary hardens. Stories reinforce this lesson. Humans who attempt to cross boundaries are punished. Kings who claim divine status fall. Cities that challenge sacred limits are erased. These narratives are not inventions, they are ethical compressions of lived experience. Even the flood, once a technical solution to overcrowding, becomes a moral tale. Its administrative logic disappears. What remains is warning. The world can be reset violently if limits are ignored. The cause is simplified. The outcome remains terrifying. Across the region, similar adjustments occur. In Anatolia, myths describe gods withdrawing after violent upheaval. In the Levant, divine presence becomes conditional. In Egypt, gods rule from afar, through cosmic order rather than direct management. Different cultures, same conclusion. The final war's legacy is not destruction alone, it is the end of an experiment. The attempt to govern the world through direct, centralized divine administration proved unsustainable. The tools required were too powerful, the margin for error too small. Human societies internalized this lesson. They developed systems that assume absence. Governance no longer depends on intervention from above. It depends on law, tradition, and collective memory. Failure is expected and managed locally. This does not mean the gods are irrelevant. It means their role has changed. They sanction rather than supervise. They judge rather than administer. They punish excess but do not correct inefficiency. The silence surrounding the final war becomes understandable in this context. To explain it fully would be to admit that even gods can miscalculate, that power can exceed control, that the world can be damaged beyond repair. Such admissions destabilize authority at every level. Better to preserve the outcome without detailing the process. Better to remember consequences than mechanisms. Better to warn than to explain. This strategy succeeds. The old system does not return. New ones emerge, adapted to a diminished world. Humanity survives not because it is protected, but because it is cautious. The land itself enforces this caution. Ruins remain visible. Empty plains resist settlement. Some places acquire reputations that persist for centuries. These reputations are not superstitions. They are cultural markers of real danger. Over time, the final war recedes into deep memory. Its edges blur. Its actors become archetypes. But its core message endures. There are thresholds beyond which intervention becomes annihilation. The Anunnaki fade into the background not as villains or heroes, but as a warning from a closed chapter. Their departure marks the moment the world became fully human, for better and for worse. What replaces them is not divine harmony but responsibility. The world no longer resets itself through external command. It accumulates consequences. History becomes linear, not cyclical. This is the true inheritance of the final war, not the destruction of cities, but the end of guardianship. Humanity inherits a damaged world and the obligation to live within its limits. And so the past is remembered carefully, indirectly, and with restraint, not because it is forgotten, but because it is understood too well. As centuries passed, the inherited caution hardened into doctrine. What had once been a lived memory of collapse became encoded into rules about what must never be attempted again. Power was still sought, but it was constrained. Knowledge was still valued, but it was segmented. The world was treated as something that could be managed only up to a point, beyond which restraint was the only rational response. This restraint appears most clearly in how later cultures treated advanced knowledge. In early Sumerian texts, technical instruction is explicit. Tablets explain how to build, measure, calculate, and organize with remarkable openness. After the collapse, that openness narrows. Knowledge becomes layered. Some things are taught widely, others are restricted to priestly or scribal elites. A small category is declared forbidden altogether. This is not superstition, it is institutional memory. Certain forms of knowledge had once enabled actions whose consequences could not be controlled. Limiting access becomes a safety measure. The phrase knowledge of the gods begins to carry an implicit warning rather than an invitation. This same logic governs later cosmologies. The universe is increasingly described as ordered by fixed boundaries. Heaven, earth, and underworld are separated sharply. Crossing between them is dangerous, often fatal. Earlier texts allowed for movement between realms with relative ease. Later ones treat such movement as exceptional and costly. The underworld, in particular, takes on new significance. It becomes a place of strict law, irreversible judgment, and no return. This reflects not a fascination with death, but an emphasis on finality. Some actions cannot be undone. Some thresholds cannot be crossed twice. The emphasis on finality mirrors the historical reality left by the collapse. Cities that vanished did not return. Lands that were abandoned remained hostile. The idea that everything could be rebuilt was disproven. Finality entered the human imagination as a governing principle. This principle reshapes morality. Earlier systems focused on service and obedience. Later ones emphasize moderation. Excess becomes dangerous. Ambition must be limited. Pride is no longer merely a social flaw. It is a cosmic risk. These moral shifts are not abstract. They encode practical lessons learned through irreversible loss. Political organization reflects the same constraint. Large, centralized empires become rarer and more cautious. When they do arise, they rely heavily on ideology, law, and distance, rather than direct control. Authority is justified through tradition rather than presence. Even conquerors frame their power as stewardship rather than ownership. The memory of sudden, total destruction also reshapes how violence is understood. War is no longer assumed to be decisive. It is something to be managed, limited, ritualized. Treaties, boundaries, and diplomatic marriages proliferate. These are not signs of peace-loving cultures. They are signs of cultures that know how bad uncontrolled escalation can become. In religious practice, sacrifice changes tone. Early offerings functioned as provisions for resident gods. Later offerings become symbolic acts of alignment. The goal is no longer to sustain divine households, but to maintain balance. The gods do not need food. They require respect for order. Omens and prophecies expand in this context. They do not predict glory. They warn of imbalance. Most recorded omens concern disruption, unusual weather, abnormal births, celestial irregularities. Prosperity is assumed to be fragile. Stability must be defended constantly. This worldview does not arise from pessimism. It arises from experience. A world that has survived systemic collapse does not assume permanence. It assumes maintenance. Even language reflects this shift. Words associated with command give way to words associated with permission. Events are said to be allowed rather than caused. Responsibility becomes diffuse. This linguistic distancing mirrors the withdrawal of direct authority. The gods themselves are reimagined accordingly. They are no longer portrayed as micromanagers or engineers. They become guarantors of cosmic boundaries. Their power is vast but impersonal. They do not intervene to fix problems created by humans. They enforce limits when those problems threaten to destabilize the whole. This is why later myths emphasize covenants, laws, and decrees. The relationship between divine and human is contractual rather than operational. Break the contract and consequences follow. But the gods do not redesign the system. They let it fail locally. The final war, in this light, becomes the unspoken reference point for all later restraint. It explains why certain questions are avoided, why certain ambitions are condemned, why certain technologies never reappear in explicit form. It is not that knowledge was lost entirely, it was compartmentalized, ritualized, and controlled. Archaeology supports this interpretation. Some techniques appear briefly and then vanish. Certain architectural or metallurgical practices do not evolve linearly. They peak and then simplify. This is not always due to lack of skill. Sometimes it reflects conscious abandonment. The disappearance of the Anunnaki from active governance is part of this same pattern. Their absence is not explained as defeat or death. It is treated as a closing of access. The door is not destroyed, it is sealed. Later generations understand this sealing intuitively. They do not try to reopen it. Instead, they build within the reduced framework left behind. Their achievements are real, but they are bounded. Civilization continues, but it no longer reaches for total control. This boundedness becomes a virtue. Wisdom is defined as knowing when to stop. Stories celebrate survival, continuity, and balance rather than domination. The heroic age gives way to the sustainable age. From this perspective, the final war achieves something paradoxical. It prevents its own repetition. By pushing the system beyond repair, it forces a permanent shift in how power, knowledge, and responsibility are understood. The silence around its final moments is therefore deliberate. Naming it fully would risk fascination. Fascination leads to imitation. The safest memory is an incomplete one. What remains is enough to warn, not enough to enable. Enough to shape behavior, not enough to reconstruct methods. Enough to explain why the world is limited, fractured, and cautious. The Anunnaki fade not into irrelevance, but into precedent. Their age becomes a boundary marker in time. separating what can be attempted from what must never be repeated. And so the legacy of the final war is not only ruin, it is the birth of restraint as a civilizational principle written into law, myth, and memory, and enforced not by gods, but by the irreversible shape of the world they left behind. What follows restraint is normalization. Once catastrophe becomes memory rather than experience, societies begin the slow process of treating the altered world as simply the way things are. The scars remain, but they are no longer interpreted as wounds. They become features. This is the stage where the consequences of the final war are fully absorbed into human identity. By this point, no one alive remembers the Anunnaki as administrators. They are remembered as distant ancestors, judges, or names embedded in ritual formulas. Their former role as managers of land and labor is no longer imaginable. The idea that gods once issued daily instructions feels implausible, even dangerous. Authority has become abstract by necessity. Human governance fills the gap, but it does so cautiously. Power is distributed across institutions rather than concentrated. Kings rule, but they rule within constraints imposed by law, custom, and omen. No ruler assumes that success guarantees permanence. Every reign is provisional, collapse is always possible. This mindset reshapes how history is recorded. Earlier texts had treated continuity as default. Later chronicles emphasize disruption. Lists of kings include sudden breaks. Dynasties end without explanation. Gaps are accepted. The expectation of smooth succession is gone. In this environment, prophecy becomes as important as memory. If the past cannot be restored, the future must be anticipated. Prophetic texts do not promise salvation. They warn of repetition. They describe signs that echo earlier disasters, strange winds, fires that fall from above, cities emptied overnight. The message is not that such events will occur again, but that they could. This conditionality is crucial. The final war taught that catastrophe is not inevitable, but it is possible if certain thresholds are crossed. Later cultures internalize this logic. They do not seek absolute safety. They seek avoidance of extremes. The same logic appears in economic practice. Surpluses are stored. Risk is diversified. Trade networks become redundant rather than centralized. When one route fails, another can compensate. This redundancy is not inefficiency. It is insurance. Religious calendars reflect this concern with balance. Festivals mark transitions, renew agreements, and reset obligations. They function as periodic recalibrations. The goal is not transcendence, but continuity. Keep the system within tolerable limits. This approach extends to warfare. Conflicts continue, but they are framed differently. Total annihilation is avoided when possible. Victories are limited. Destruction is followed by restoration. The idea of rendering land permanently unusable is treated with horror. It belongs to a remembered past. This horror is not theoretical. It is anchored in stories of places that never recovered. Akkad remains the archetype. Its absence is more powerful than any ruin. A city erased so completely that its location becomes uncertain embodies the ultimate warning. Over time, that warning is generalized. It no longer refers to a specific city or god. It refers to a principle. Some actions eliminate the future. Cultures that survive are those that learn to recognize and avoid such actions. Language evolves to support this recognition. Terms associated with fate shift meaning. Fate is no longer something imposed mechanically by divine decree. It becomes a consequence of accumulated choices. The divine role is to enforce outcomes, not to design them. This shift places unprecedented responsibility on humans. If gods no longer manage the world directly, failure cannot be blamed upward. Humans inherit not divine power, but divine risk. They must act knowing that repair is not guaranteed. Education reflects this inheritance. Instruction emphasizes precedent. Students learn what happened before, not to emulate it, but to avoid it. History becomes a guide to limits rather than a source of inspiration. Even creativity adapts. Art becomes less monumental, more symbolic. Grandeur is expressed through complexity rather than scale. The impulse to build ever larger gives way to the impulse to build wisely. None of this implies that the world becomes timid. It becomes selective. Ambition survives, but it is channeled. Exploration continues, but within boundaries. Innovation occurs, but with caution. The final war thus achieves a delayed effect. It reshapes not only the immediate aftermath, but the long-term trajectory of civilization. It embeds an awareness of fragility into cultural DNA. This awareness is why later societies react so strongly to signs of imbalance. An eclipse is not just an astronomical event, it is a reminder that systems can fail. A famine is not just a shortage, it is a warning that thresholds may have been crossed. The gods in this framework function as enforcers of those thresholds. They do not intervene constantly, they intervene decisively when limits are ignored. This makes them less present but more absolute. The Anunnaki, once enforcers themselves, become symbols of what happens when enforcement is too direct, too powerful, too entangled with the system it governs. Their story is not one of malice, but of overreach. As generations pass, the emotional weight of the final war fades, but its structural lessons remain. Civilization stabilizes at a lower intensity. The world becomes less extreme, less volatile, and less ambitious in certain dimensions. This stabilization allows survival, but at a cost. Some possibilities are never revisited, some questions are never asked. Some paths are closed permanently. Humanity lives within a narrower range of outcomes, but that range is survivable. The silence that once surrounded the final war now functions as background noise. People do not speak of it, but they live according to its constraints. It is present in laws, customs, and fears that no longer have explicit explanations. In this way, the final war never truly ends. It becomes an invisible architecture shaping every decision made afterward, not as a story told, but as a condition accepted. The Anunnaki disappear from action, but not from consequence. Their legacy is a world where power is feared as much as it is desired, and where survival depends not on mastery, but on restraint learned the hardest way possible. At some point, the memory of catastrophe stops feeling external and begins to feel inherited. It is no longer recalled as something that happened to others in another age, but as something embedded in how the world works. By the time later civilizations flourish, the final war has already been absorbed into assumptions about reality itself. The world is no longer expected to be safe, predictable, or endlessly recoverable. It is expected to endure provided certain lines are not crossed. This expectation shapes how later societies interpret power. Authority is no longer viewed as an absolute right granted from above, but as a conditional role that can be revoked. Kings rule, but they rule under constant scrutiny from priests, omens, and tradition. A ruler's legitimacy depends not only on success, but on restraint. Expansion without justification becomes suspicious. Ambition without balance becomes dangerous. The texts reflect this anxiety subtly. Later chronicles dwell on signs that precede downfall rather than on triumphs that precede greatness. Prosperity is often narrated briefly while collapse is described in detail. This imbalance is intentional. The lesson preserved is not how to rise, but how to avoid falling too far. Even when empires grow large, they do so cautiously. Borders are marked carefully. Conquest is justified through ritual language rather than raw force. The language of destiny is invoked, but it is framed as permission rather than command. Fate allows, it does not compel. This framing preserves the idea that limits still exist. The gods in this worldview function less like rulers and more like constraints. They are invoked to stabilize, not to innovate. Prayers ask for continuity, protection, and balance. Rarely do they ask for radical change. Change is feared because it recalls an age when radical solutions led to irreversible outcomes. This fear also shapes how disaster is interpreted. When floods, famines, or plagues occur, they are not immediately seen as punishments, they are examined as signals. What imbalance has been introduced? What boundary has been ignored? The response is corrective rather than defiant. One of the most striking features of later religious thought is the absence of nostalgia for direct divine rule. Earlier ages are described as powerful but also volatile. The present, though diminished, is safer. This inversion is crucial. It means the loss of divine proximity is not universally mourned. It is accepted as a necessary trade-off. The idea that gods once walked among humans becomes a warning rather than a promise. It suggests proximity brings danger, not comfort. Distance becomes protection. Transcendence replaces presence. This perspective explains why later traditions place so much emphasis on law. Law replaces command. Written codes replace spoken decrees. The authority of text becomes paramount because text is stable. It does not change its mind. It does not escalate emotionally. It cannot deploy catastrophic solutions impulsively. Law is humanity's answer to the memory of divine volatility. It is an attempt to govern without triggering existential risk. Even when laws are harsh, they are finite. They do not destroy the land itself. Education reinforces this logic. Scribes are trained to preserve consistency, not creativity. Innovation exists, but it is incremental. Radical departure is discouraged unless necessity demands it. This conservatism is not stagnation, it is survival strategy. The final war also alters how humanity understands responsibility. Earlier systems placed responsibility upward. If something failed, the gods were displeased or inattentive. After the collapse, responsibility shifts downward. Humans must maintain balance themselves. The gods enforce outcomes, but they do not manage processes. This shift is psychologically profound. It produces anxiety, but also agency. Humans are no longer tools in a divine project. They are stewards of a damaged world. Their choices matter because no higher authority will automatically correct them. The persistence of ritual in this context serves a stabilizing function. Ritual is repetition. It reinforces boundaries. It prevents drift. Festivals, sacrifices, and prayers are not about control. They are about alignment. When alignment fails, consequences follow, but they are framed as natural rather than arbitrary. This framing allows societies to endure hardship without collapsing into despair. Suffering has meaning, but not randomness. Across cultures influenced by Mesopotamian thought, this pattern repeats. The gods withdraw, law advances, history becomes a teacher rather than a cycle. The past is no longer something to be reenacted, it is something to be avoided. This avoidance is visible in how myths are edited over time. Earlier versions contain raw conflict, ambiguity, and failure. Later versions smooth these edges. Conflict is externalized, failure is moralized. The narrative becomes safer to tell, but the underlying structure remains. There was a time when the system broke. It broke because power exceeded restraint. It broke because solutions became too large, too final, too damaging, and when it broke, it could not be repaired. The silence around certain details is therefore not ignorance, it is containment. Some knowledge is remembered only through its effects. To remember more would invite curiosity. Curiosity invites repetition. The final war thus becomes a negative template. It defines what must never be done again, not through explicit prohibition, but through the shape of the world left behind. Cities are built smaller, authority is layered, knowledge is compartmentalized, ambition is ritualized, distance from the divine is normalized. None of this restores what was lost. The world remains diminished compared to the age of direct divine administration, but it is stable enough to persist. That persistence becomes the new measure of success. By the time later civilizations look back, the Anunnaki are no longer central actors. They are markers of an era when different rules applied. Their disappearance is not framed as tragedy. It is framed as closure. The final war, seen through this lens, is not only an ending, it is a boundary event. It separates a world governed by overwhelming power from a world governed by accumulated consequence. Everything that follows operates on the far side of that boundary, shaped by lessons learned too violently to ever be forgotten, even when no one remembers the details anymore. As the centuries layered over one another, the consequences of the final war no longer appeared as memories, but as assumptions. People were born into a world already shaped by withdrawal, limitation, and distance. No one expected gods to arrive and solve problems. No one expected cities to be immune from collapse. The absence of intervention was no longer shocking, it was normal. This normalization fundamentally altered how catastrophe itself was understood. In earlier ages, destruction demanded explanation. After the collapse, destruction demanded preparation. Societies no longer asked why disaster occurred. They asked whether it could have been anticipated. This shift marks a turning point in human self-perception. Survival became a skill rather than a gift. The role of the divine narrowed further. Gods became arbiters of thresholds rather than managers of outcomes. They were invoked at moments of transition, crisis, or imbalance, but not for routine governance. Their silence was expected. Their intervention, when it came, was feared. This fear was not of cruelty, but of scale. Divine action was associated with consequences that exceeded human capacity to repair. When gods acted, land changed, cities vanished. Time itself seemed to divide into before and after. The safest relationship, therefore, was distance. This logic reshaped sacred space. Temples were still built, but they became more symbolic than functional. They marked orientation, not habitation. Sacred objects were no longer tools of administration, but relics of connection. Contact was mediated, filtered, and controlled. Even the language of prayer evolved. Earlier prayers demanded action. Later ones requested restraint. Do not turn your face away becomes more common than grant us victory. The greatest fear was abandonment, not opposition. A God who opposed could be negotiated with. A God who withdrew could not. This anxiety reflects an understanding that withdrawal had once preceded irreversible collapse. The memory of that sequence remained embedded in ritual language. Keep the gods near, but not too near. Keep them watching, but not acting. Political power absorbed the same lesson. Rulers framed themselves as buffers between the divine and the population. Their role was not to channel divine force, but to prevent it. Kings who claimed too much favor were treated with suspicion. Excessive piety could be as dangerous as impiety. This balance is visible in law codes that stress proportionality. Punishments are severe but measured. Retribution is codified to prevent escalation. The goal is to resolve conflict before it reaches a scale that invites higher intervention. The concept of collective responsibility also emerges strongly in this period. Disaster is no longer blamed on individual failure alone. It is attributed to systemic imbalance. Entire communities engage in rituals of correction, fasting, and renewal. These are not acts of submission, they are acts of risk management. Over time, the idea that the world has limits becomes central to identity. Humans define themselves not by dominion, but by endurance. Success is measured in continuity rather than expansion. The highest achievement is to pass the world intact to the next generation. This worldview does not eliminate ambition, but it reframes it. Ambition becomes internal rather than external. Mastery of self replaces mastery of environment. Wisdom replaces power as the highest virtue. The Anunnaki in this context are remembered as beings who possessed immense power but lacked restraint. Their story becomes an implicit warning about what happens when capability outpaces wisdom. This interpretation is never stated explicitly, but it shapes every retelling. Even in cultures far removed from Mesopotamia, the same pattern emerges. Stories of ancient ages filled with wonders end in catastrophe. The present age is quieter, less miraculous, but safer. The message is consistent. Proximity to absolute power is incompatible with survival. This lesson influences how innovation is treated. New technologies are approached cautiously. Their risks are debated. Their spread is controlled. When tools prove too disruptive, they are abandoned. This selectivity is not conservatism. It is collective memory in action. The final war thus becomes a silent regulator of progress. It does not forbid advancement. It sets boundaries. It ensures that growth does not outrun responsibility. The loss of direct divine governance also accelerates the development of ethics independent of divine command. Humans must decide what is right without expecting correction from above. Moral systems become more introspective, more relational, more focused on harm reduction. This does not weaken religion, it strengthens it by narrowing its scope. Religion becomes a source of meaning rather than control. It offers orientation in a world that no longer guarantees safety. By this stage, the final war is no longer discussed even in oblique terms. Its effects are everywhere, but its narrative has dissolved into structure. People live inside its outcome without knowing its name. The absence of a name is telling. Naming grants power. To name the final war would be to frame it, analyze it, perhaps even admire it. Silence denies it that power. Silence keeps it from becoming a model. What remains instead is a deep-seated aversion to absolute solutions. Total destruction, total purification, total control. These ideas provoke instinctive unease. They recall something that went terribly wrong. Civilization, rebuilt under these constraints, becomes more resilient precisely because it accepts imperfection. It no longer seeks to eliminate risk entirely. It seeks to live with risk intelligently. The Anunnaki recede fully into the past at this point. They are no longer actors, warnings, or even judges. They are precedent. Their age defines what not to repeat. And so the world continues, not healed, but stabilized. Not perfected, but constrained. The final war achieves its most enduring effect, not through destruction, but through the permanent recalibration of what humanity believes is possible, permissible, and wise. When distance becomes permanent, explanation gives way to ritual. By the time the last echoes of the Anunnaki fade from active memory, their absence has already been woven into daily life. People no longer ask where the gods went. They ask how to live in a world where they do not return. This shift is subtle but decisive. It marks the point where the final war ceases to be history and becomes environment. Ritual fills the space once occupied by direct authority, not because ritual replaces power, but because it replaces certainty. In a world where intervention is rare and unpredictable, repetition becomes stability. The same words, spoken at the same times, the same gestures repeated across generations, create continuity where command once existed. Ritual does not change reality, it anchors people within it. This anchoring is especially visible in how later societies treat disaster. When calamity strikes, the response is not rebellion or expectation of rescue, it is alignment. Communities seek to re-establish balance through collective action, not to summon a solution from above. The gods are acknowledged but not summoned as problem solvers. They are witnesses, not engineers. The language used in later prayers reflects this restraint. Requests are framed carefully, often negatively. Do not abandon, do not destroy, do not turn away. These are not demands for intervention. They are appeals for continuity. The greatest fear is not punishment, but silence. This fear reveals a deep understanding of the past. Silence once followed withdrawal, and withdrawal once preceded collapse. Maintaining attention, even distant attention, is therefore essential. The gods do not need to act. They need to remain oriented toward the world. At the same time, the responsibility for maintenance shifts fully to human systems. Infrastructure, law, agriculture, and defense are treated as human obligations. Failure is attributed to mismanagement, not divine whim. This does not remove religion from public life. It redefines its role. Religion becomes a framework for limits. It defines what should not be done more than what must be done. Sacred prohibitions multiply. Certain places are not to be entered. Certain acts are not to be repeated. Certain knowledge is not to be pursued. These prohibitions are not arbitrary. They map onto remembered danger. This mapping is clearest in how later cultures treat the concept of total destruction. Fire from above, consuming cities without remainder, becomes the ultimate taboo. Such destruction is associated with divine decision, not human action. Humans are warned not to imitate it. War may destroy walls and armies, but the land itself must be spared. This distinction shapes military ethics. Scorched earth tactics are feared. Poisoning water sources is condemned. Acts that permanently alter the environment are treated as crimes against order itself. Even when desperation tempts such actions, memory restrains them. The final war thus leaves behind an unspoken code. It is not written in law, but it is enforced through cultural revulsion. Certain strategies are simply not acceptable, regardless of advantage. They belong to an age that ended badly. Education reinforces this code indirectly. Students learn myths that emphasize consequences over causes. The why is blurred, the result is clear. Cities that offended the order were erased. Lands that crossed boundaries became barren. The lesson does not require technical explanation. This approach to teaching is deliberate. Technical understanding could invite replication. Moral understanding discourages it. The goal is not comprehension, but avoidance. Over time, this avoidance reshapes innovation itself. Creativity survives, but it is guided inward. Philosophical, ethical, and legal systems flourish. Engineering advances continue, but within constrained domains. The world is improved, but not transformed. This restraint produces a paradox. Civilization becomes more sophisticated as it becomes less ambitious. Complexity increases while scale decreases. Systems are optimized rather than expanded. This optimization allows societies to endure shocks that would have destroyed earlier empires. The gods, in this context, become guarantors of boundary rather than agents of change. They represent the outer limits of action. When those limits are violated, consequences follow. When they are respected, life continues. The Anunnaki, remembered faintly, embody the opposite principle. They represent a time when power acted directly, decisively, and catastrophically. Their memory functions as a warning embedded deep in cultural instinct. This instinct explains why later traditions often portray the ancient world as simultaneously glorious and dangerous. Wonders existed, but they ended in ruin. Miracles occurred, but they invited annihilation. The present world, though diminished, is survivable. Even hope is redefined. It is no longer hope for transformation, but hope for preservation. The best future is one that resembles the present, not one that surpasses it dramatically. This redefinition has profound implications for identity. Humans stop seeing themselves as participants in a divine project and begin seeing themselves as custodians of a fragile inheritance. The world is not a stage for cosmic drama. It is a system that must be maintained. The final war in this light was not only an ending, it was a transition from a managed world to a contingent one, a world where nothing guarantees survival except restraint, cooperation, and memory. Memory itself becomes selective. What is remembered is not the sequence of events, but the shape of danger. The details fade, the pattern remains. Power without limit leads to irreversible loss. By the time this understanding fully settles, the Anunnaki have ceased to matter as individual figures. Their names persist, but their actions do not. What matters is the boundary their failure established. That boundary is invisible but firm. It defines how far authority can extend, how much the land can be altered, how decisively problems can be solved. It defines the maximum scale of acceptable intervention. Everything that follows operates within this boundary. Civilizations rise and fall, but they do so without erasing the ground beneath them. History becomes survivable. The final war achieves its quietest, most enduring victory here, not through dominance, but through limitation. By ruling the future, but by constraining it. And in that constraint, humanity finds a way to continue in a world that no longer resets itself, guided not by gods who act, but by memory of gods who once acted too much. When a boundary becomes invisible yet absolute, it reshapes instinct. By the time later civilizations reach maturity, people no longer need to be taught what must not be done. They feel it. Certain actions trigger unease before reason intervenes. Certain ambitions feel wrong even when they promise reward. This instinctive restraint is the deepest legacy of the final war. The fear is not of punishment in the narrow sense. It is fear of consequence without remedy. The ancient world learned at an unbearable cost that some outcomes cannot be reversed. Once land is poisoned, it cannot be argued back into fertility. Once a city is erased, no decree can summon it whole again. This knowledge settles into culture like gravity. As a result, later societies develop a heightened sensitivity to scale. Small failures are tolerable, large ones are terrifying. The idea of total solutions, total purification, or total victory becomes suspect. Language itself reflects this discomfort. Words associated with absolutes are avoided or softened. Even divine judgments are framed as measured rather than final. This sensitivity appears clearly in later myths of destruction. Fire falls, floods rise, cities fall, but always with limits. Survivors remain, life continues, the world is wounded, not erased. These narratives differ sharply from the implied totality of earlier events. They represent a recalibration of imagination. Imagination itself becomes regulated. Earlier texts imagine gods reshaping the world directly. Later ones imagine balance, cycles, and return. Creation stories emphasize order emerging from chaos, not annihilation imposed from above. Destruction is framed as correction, not replacement. This is not accidental. Cultures imagine what they believe is possible. After the final war, replacement becomes unthinkable. Only repair, however slow, remains acceptable. Political thought absorbs the same lesson. Even the most powerful rulers present their authority as temporary. They emphasize succession, continuity, and legacy rather than domination. The idea of an eternal ruler becomes dangerous rather than desirable. This shift affects how rebellion is understood as well. Earlier rebellions, even divine ones, aimed at seizing control. Later rebellions aim at reform or separation. Overthrow is limited. Destruction of the whole is avoided. The memory of systemic collapse restrains radical action. The treatment of archives offers another window into this mindset. Earlier civilizations preserved everything they could. Later ones are selective. Some records are copied endlessly. Others are allowed to disappear. This is not negligence, it is curation. What destabilizes is quietly set aside. The loss of certain texts is therefore meaningful. Knowledge did not vanish randomly, it vanished according to risk. Techniques, narratives, or concepts that threatened to reopen closed boundaries were not transmitted. Silence becomes a protective mechanism. This mechanism operates even within religion. Divine names are restricted. Sacred formulas are shortened. Mysteries are preserved, but not explained. The goal is reverence without access, or without instruction. The gods themselves are reimagined to fit this pattern. They become distant, unified, and abstract. Internal conflict disappears from theology. A divided pantheon would imply repeatable crisis. Unity suggests stability. This theological smoothing does not deny the past, it seals it. The conflict among gods is not disproven, it is rendered irrelevant. What matters is the present order, not the chaos that preceded it. Across regions influenced by Mesopotamian memory, the same impulse appears. In Egypt, cosmic order is elevated above divine personality. In the Levant, divine will becomes singular and absolute. In Anatolia, gods withdraw after great upheaval, different solutions to the same problem, how to prevent repetition. The final war thus becomes the negative foundation of later cosmologies. It is the thing that must never happen again. Everything else is built around that absence. Even philosophical traditions echo this restraint. Thought shifts from speculation about ultimate power to inquiry into ethics, balance, and moderation. The good life is no longer one of conquest or transformation, but of harmony with limits. This emphasis on moderation is often misunderstood as cultural decline. It is not decline, it is adaptation. A civilization that has seen the consequences of excess learns to value sustainability over spectacle. Art follows the same trajectory. Monumentality gives way to refinement. Grandeur is expressed through detail rather than scale. The impulse to overwhelm is replaced by the impulse to endure. All of this suggests that the final war achieved something no deliberate reform could have achieved. It imposed restraint not through law, but through irreversible consequence. It taught limits by exceeding them. The Anunnaki, in this context, are not remembered as evil. They are remembered as powerful beyond wisdom. Their failure is not moral, but structural. They operated a system whose tools outpaced its safeguards. This interpretation allows later cultures to preserve reverence without imitation. The gods remain sacred, but their former mode of action is rejected. Power is respected but not replicated. As time passes, this rejection becomes unconscious. People no longer remember what they are rejecting. They simply live within the boundaries left behind. The final war becomes a condition rather than a memory. This condition defines the human era, a world where intervention is limited, where consequences accumulate, where repair is possible only within narrow margins, where survival depends on restraint. The transition is complete when the idea of direct, divine rule becomes absurd. Later thinkers cannot imagine gods managing irrigation or labor. Such closeness feels wrong. The distance is not loss, it is protection. The final war thus fades into silence, not because it is forgotten, but because it has done its work. It has reshaped instinct, imagination, and identity. It has defined the maximum scale of acceptable action. What remains is a quieter world, less dramatic, less catastrophic, but survivable, a world that no longer resets itself through overwhelming force. And within that world, humanity learns to live not under guardianship, but under consequence, guided by boundaries written not in law or scripture alone, but into the deep structure of culture itself. That is the true end of the final war, not in fire or withdrawal, but in the permanent internalization of limits that can never again be crossed. Once limits become internalized, they no longer feel imposed, they feel natural. By the late stages of cultural memory, people do not consciously restrain themselves because of ancient catastrophe. They restrain themselves because anything else feels wrong. The boundary left by the final war is no longer remembered as a lesson. It has become intuition. This intuition shapes how future dangers are perceived. Threats are no longer evaluated solely by their immediate impact, but by their potential to cascade. The question is not how much damage an action can cause today, but whether it risks reopening conditions that cannot be closed again. This way of thinking did not arise from philosophy. It arose from loss. Later societies become acutely aware of thresholds. Floods are dangerous but manageable. Fires are destructive but containable. What is feared are events that alter the land itself, events that erase the possibility of return. These are treated as qualitatively different from ordinary disasters. They belong to a separate category of danger. This categorization explains why certain natural phenomena are mythologized so intensely. Winds that kill, fires that fall from the sky, waters that consume everything, these are not just forces of nature, they are reminders of a boundary once crossed. Their mythic status does not exaggerate them, it quarantines them. Quarantine is a recurring theme. Ideas, places, and even words are isolated. Some ruins are avoided, some names are not spoken casually, some knowledge is transmitted only in coded form. These practices are often dismissed as superstition, but they function as safeguards. They prevent casual engagement with dangerous concepts. The same instinct appears in how later cultures respond to technological or organizational breakthroughs. When new capabilities emerge, they are tested cautiously. Their effects are observed. If consequences spread too widely or too quickly, the capability is restricted or abandoned. Progress is allowed, but only incrementally. This incrementalism is not lack of imagination, it is controlled imagination. Societies imagine futures that resemble the present slightly improved, not radically transformed. The dream of total redesign has been replaced by the goal of continuity. This shift has profound implications for how humanity understands time. Earlier ages imagined resets, floods, renewals, new beginnings. After the final war, time becomes linear and accumulative. Damage persists, choices stack. There is no clean slate. Linear time creates accountability. Actions cannot be erased by divine reset, they must be lived with. This realization anchors ethics in consequence rather than obedience. Right action is defined by what preserves the future, not by what pleases authority. The gods within this framework are no longer arbiters of daily affairs. They are symbols of ultimate consequence. They do not need to speak often. Their silence is part of their authority. When they act, it is decisive, not corrective. This redefinition allows religion to coexist with human autonomy. Humans act freely within limits. Gods enforce those limits only when they are violated at scale. This balance reduces dependency while preserving awe. The Anunnaki, when remembered at all, occupy a unique position in this worldview. They represent an era before restraint, when power acted without sufficient feedback. Their story explains why such an era must not return. Importantly, they are not demonized. Demonization would invite rebellion. Instead, they are historicized. Their age is framed as necessary but incomplete, powerful but unstable. This framing discourages imitation without denying significance. As myths travel across cultures, this framing persists. The names change, the details shift, but the structure remains. An ancient age of closeness ends in catastrophe. A quieter age follows. The quieter age survives. This pattern appears so consistently that it becomes invisible. People stop noticing it because it defines normality. The idea that gods once governed directly becomes strange, even uncomfortable. Distance feels right. This comfort with distance is the final psychological shift produced by the final war. It marks acceptance. Humanity no longer longs for return. It no longer asks what was lost, it focuses on what can be preserved. Preservation becomes the highest value. Knowledge is preserved selectively. Land is preserved cautiously. Social order is preserved through redundancy rather than control. Even memory is preserved imperfectly because perfect memory would be destabilizing. The silence surrounding the most destructive phases is therefore intentional at a cultural level, not planned by any one authority but reinforced across generations. Each generation inherits a partial story and learns not to ask for more. This inheritance is effective because it aligns with lived reality. The world itself enforces the lesson. Barren lands do not lie. Missing cities do not return. The absence of gods from daily affairs is consistent and enduring. By the time later civilizations reflect on origins, they no longer see the final war as an event. They see it as the end of events of that kind, a boundary after which history must proceed differently. This perspective explains why later apocalyptic visions are always deferred. They belong to an ultimate future, not an imminent one. Total endings are postponed indefinitely. The present must be protected from them. The final war thus shapes not only memory of the past but imagination of the future. Futures are envisioned as extended presents, not radical departures. Hope is invested in longevity, not transformation. This orientation allows civilization to persist across millennia. It may limit ambition, but it prevents extinction. It trades glory for survival. At this stage, the Anunnaki are no longer necessary even as symbols. The world functions without them. Their lesson has been absorbed fully into human behavior. What remains is a civilization built on an invisible line, drawn once at unbearable cost and never crossed again, not because it is forbidden, but because everything beyond it has already been lost once, and nothing waits there worth losing the world a second time. At the far edge of memory, where events dissolve into structure, the final war leaves behind one last transformation. It redefines what survival means. Survival is no longer escape from destruction, nor victory over an enemy. It becomes the ability to continue without reopening what was sealed. This redefinition is quiet, but it governs everything that follows. Later, civilizations do not see themselves as rebuilding a fallen world. They see themselves as inhabiting a reduced one. This reduction is accepted, even defended. Grandeur is treated with suspicion. Anything that promises total renewal is examined for hidden cost. The assumption is no longer that loss can be undone, but that some losses define the future permanently. This outlook changes how people respond to power itself. Power is no longer admired for its reach, but for its restraint. A ruler who knows when not to act is praised more than one who acts decisively. Inaction, once associated with weakness, becomes a sign of wisdom when action risks irreversible harm. The same logic governs collective decision-making. Councils, assemblies, and layered authority structures replace singular command. Decision-making slows deliberately. Delay is not inefficiency, it is insulation. Time becomes a buffer against catastrophic error. This cultural patience stands in stark contrast to the earlier age, when solutions were swift and absolute. The final war taught that speed magnifies consequence. Slowness absorbs shock. This lesson permeates governance, law, and even social custom. Disputes are ritualized. Conflict is contained within frameworks designed to prevent escalation. Revenge is regulated. Feuds are limited. The goal is not justice in the abstract, but preservation of the system itself. No grievance is allowed to threaten continuity. Even language adapts to this priority. Hyperbole fades from official speech. Declarations become conditional. Certainty is replaced with caution. Leaders speak in probabilities, not promises. This rhetorical shift mirrors internalized fear of overcommitment. The natural world is treated differently as well. It is no longer assumed to be infinitely exploitable. Boundaries are recognized even if imperfectly enforced. Overuse is linked to disaster. Balance becomes a practical concern, not an ethical abstraction. Agricultural cycles, water management, and settlement patterns all reflect this awareness. Expansion is checked by sustainability. When land shows signs of exhaustion, it is wrested or abandoned. The idea of forcing productivity at any cost is associated with ruin. Religion, in this phase, functions almost entirely as memory discipline. It reminds communities of limits without recounting their origin. Sacred law defines what must not be done. Ritual reinforces humility before forces that cannot be controlled. The gods are invoked not to grant power, but to witness restraint. Divine approval is associated with moderation. Excess invites silence or withdrawal, which is feared more than punishment. Silence means abandonment. Abandonment recalls collapse. This fear does not paralyze, it focuses. It encourages redundancy, cooperation, and long-term thinking. Societies learn to build systems that fail gracefully rather than catastrophically. Failure becomes survivable. The final war thus produces an inversion of values. What was once admired becomes dangerous. What was once ordinary becomes heroic. Endurance replaces dominance, balance replaces conquest, continuity replaces renewal. At this stage, the Anunnaki are no longer needed even as a cautionary reference. Their lesson has been fully internalized. People no longer need to remember who crossed the boundary. They only know that the boundary exists. This internalization explains why later civilizations can appear conservative, even stagnant, to modern observers. But this appearance masks resilience. A system designed to avoid collapse can persist far longer than one designed to maximize expansion. The world that emerges is not utopian. It contains injustice, suffering, and failure. But it avoids extinction-level decisions. It avoids total solutions. It avoids the temptation to erase and begin again. This avoidance is the true inheritance of the final war. Humanity learns that beginning again is the most dangerous fantasy of all. Once the world is erased, there may be no one left to rebuild it. The silence surrounding the final moments of the war is therefore not a gap in knowledge, it is a boundary of thought. To imagine those moments too clearly would be to flirt with their logic. The imagination itself must be restrained. This restraint does not diminish humanity, it matures it. A species that has learned its limits can survive without guardians. A species that has not will eventually demand another reset. By the end of this long transformation, the world has stabilized into something new. Not the world the Anunnaki designed, not the world humans might have wished for, but a world capable of persistence. History continues within this framework. Empires rise and fall, religions evolve, technologies advance cautiously, but none attempt to re-establish direct, total control over existence itself. The final war does not echo as thunder in this world. It echoes as absence, as the missing option, as the solution that no longer exists. And in that absence, humanity finds its most durable achievement, the ability to live with consequence, to accept loss without demanding erasure, and to move forward in a world that will never again allow itself to be remade from nothing. That, more than any victory or defeat, is where the final war truly ends. At the farthest edge of this long arc, where cause has fully dissolved into consequence, the final war leaves behind no monuments, no treaties, and no clear ending. What it leaves instead is a condition of existence. The world that follows is not one that remembers the war explicitly, but one that behaves as if remembering would be too dangerous. By this stage, the silence is complete. Not enforced, not commanded, but chosen. Civilizations no longer require reminders of what happened when absolute power acted without restraint. The shape of the world itself provides that reminder. Empty spaces remain empty. certain ambitions never reappear. Certain questions are no longer asked, not because they are forbidden, but because they feel wrong. Humanity moves forward within this inherited boundary. Progress continues, but it proceeds laterally rather than vertically. Knowledge accumulates, but it does not concentrate into a single point of control. Power is distributed, fragmented, and mediated. No one institution is allowed to become indispensable because indispensability invites catastrophe. This is the deepest structural consequence of the final war. It ends the idea that any single authority, divine or human, can safely manage everything. Centralization becomes a risk factor. Resilience comes from dispersion. Even when later empires attempt to consolidate power, they do so cautiously and temporarily. They rely on symbolism, law, and tradition rather than direct intervention. Their collapse, when it comes, does not erase the world beneath them. It leaves ruins, not voids. This difference matters. The voids belong to the earlier age. The gods, now fully transcendent, no longer threaten the world through presence. Their power is conceptual rather than operational. They define limits, but do not test them. Their withdrawal is complete and stable. There is no expectation of return. This expectation, or lack of it, is crucial. Hope no longer points backward. Humanity does not await a golden age restored. It accepts that the most powerful age ended because it could not sustain itself. The future is defined not by recovery of that power, but by avoidance of its mistakes. In this acceptance, humanity gains something unexpected: autonomy, not freedom from consequence, but freedom from guardianship. The world is no longer supervised, it is endured. This endurance reshapes meaning itself. Meaning is no longer found in proximity to power, but in continuity across time. Traditions endure because they stabilize. Relationships matter because they persist. Memory matters because it prevents repetition. The final war, seen from this distance, was not simply destructive. It was corrective in the harshest possible way. It demonstrated that some systems cannot be reformed, only abandoned. It proved that overwhelming solutions produce overwhelming damage. What followed was not enlightenment, but adaptation. Humanity learned to live in a diminished world without demanding its expansion. It learned to value repair over replacement. It learned to fear final answers. This fear is not weakness. It is wisdom earned at unbearable cost. It prevents the return of ideas that promise total control, total purification, or total renewal. Such ideas are recognized instinctively as dangerous, even when dressed in noble language. The absence of the Anunnaki from later history is therefore not a mystery. It is an outcome. Their mode of existence was incompatible with a world that had learned restraint. Their continued presence would have reintroduced unacceptable risk. They do not vanish into nothing. They vanish into precedent. Their age defines a closed category of action. Everything beyond that category is off limits, not by decree, but by consensus forged through survival. This consensus is fragile but durable. It does not rely on belief alone. It is reinforced by material reality. The land remembers, the ruins remain, the gaps in history persist. The world itself enforces the lesson, and so the final war ends not with a final act, but with a permanent change in what is imaginable. The most dangerous ideas are no longer compelling. The most extreme powers are no longer desired. The fantasy of starting over has lost its appeal. Humanity inherits a world that will not reset itself. Every action matters because it cannot be undone. This is the burden and the gift left behind. The silence that surrounds the final war is therefore not emptiness. It is containment. It ensures that the war does not become inspiration. It ensures that the conditions which produced it are never recreated intentionally. In this silence, civilization continues imperfectly, cautiously, persistently. The absence of gods walking among humans is not mourned. It is accepted as the price of survival. The Anunnaki fade fully into the past, not as defeated rulers, but as the last to exercise a kind of power the world can no longer tolerate. Their departure marks the true beginning of human history as we know it. Not because humans triumphed, but because they remained. And in that remaining, in living within limits rather than seeking to abolish them, the final war achieves its quietest and most lasting resolution.